If someone asked how much your spending habits have changed over the last 10 years, and you'd probably say they haven't changed that much. After all, you didn't start buying yachts, you didn't start wearing luxury brands, and you're not living like a millionaire. And yet, the middle class is buying more than at any other point in history. So the question is, what exactly is causing the middle class to spend more and more? Because there is a culprit in this story. And it's not inflation, it's not income, it's not a lack of financial education, and it's not that people suddenly lost control of their money. In fact, the real reason is much quieter than that. So quiet that it can change the way millions of people consume without them having the slightest idea it's happening. And the most interesting part is that once you finally notice this factor, you start seeing decisions that once felt completely natural in a totally different way. My name is Ben, and in this video I'm going to show you the real reason the middle class is buying more than ever, why it has become so powerful in recent years, what invisible consequences it creates for building wealth, and most importantly, how to stop it from continuing to control the way you use your money. If you enjoy this kind of content about personal finance and financial behavior, subscribe to the channel. What you're about to discover may completely change the way you think about spending. There's a feeling a lot of people have today, but almost no one can fully explain. It seems like maintaining what most people would consider a completely normal life requires far more money than it did just a few years ago. We're not talking about a life of luxury or extravagant spending. We're talking about what almost anyone would describe as an ordinary life, paying the bills, living in a comfortable home, owning a reliable car, going out once in a while, replacing your devices when they become outdated. None of that sounds excessive, and yet more and more people feel like they have to work much harder just to maintain that exact same lifestyle. What's interesting is that this change didn't happen overnight. It happened so gradually that almost nobody noticed it while it was happening. What used to feel like an extra comfort slowly stopped feeling like an extra. Then it became a convenience. Until, at some point, it simply became the expectation. And once something feels expected, we rarely stop to ask when that expectation first appeared. Most people believe they started spending more because they wanted a better life, because they worked harder, because they wanted a little more comfort. And that explanation sounds completely reasonable. But was it really a conscious decision? Or did the very definition of what it means to live a normal life slowly change without almost anyone noticing? What makes this even more interesting is that this feeling didn't appear in just a handful of people. It showed up at the same time for millions of families, in different cities, with different careers and completely different lives. When that many people start moving in the same direction without ever planning it, maybe there's something much bigger happening beneath the surface. And there's one detail that almost nobody notices. It's also exactly where this entire story begins. First, we need to challenge a common belief. Almost nobody wakes up in the morning thinking, "Today I'm going to spend more money than I should." In fact, the exact opposite happens. Most people genuinely believe they're simply making completely normal, responsible decisions that make sense for the stage of life they're in. And that's exactly what makes this so difficult to notice, because almost no purchase feels excessive when you're making it. Replacing an old phone that doesn't work as well anymore, upgrading to a better internet plan because you work from home, signing up for a service you know you'll actually use. When you look at each of those decisions individually, almost none of them seem like a mistake. Quite the opposite. Every single one feels perfectly justified. And when every decision makes sense on its own, no one feels like they're raising their standard of living. It simply feels like they're doing what makes the most sense at that moment. What's interesting is that the real impact of this process never shows up right away. It shows up months, sometimes even years later. When you look back and realize your cost of living has become much higher than it used to be. But when you try to pinpoint exactly when that happened, you can't find a single moment that explains the change. Because there isn't one. It wasn't one big decision. And it wasn't one specific purchase. It was a long series of small decisions that, taken individually, seemed completely normal. But over time, those decisions added up and completely changed the size of your monthly expenses. And maybe that's the most fascinating part of this entire story. This process doesn't happen by accident. There's a mechanism quietly working behind the scenes. And the most surprising part is that it starts long before any purchase is ever made. If that mechanism is powerful enough to change the way millions of people spend their money, then the question becomes unavoidable. How does it actually work? The answer begins with the very first stage. And surprisingly enough, it has nothing to do with money. The first thing you need to understand is that this mechanism doesn't work the way most people imagine. Almost everyone believes this process begins at the moment of purchase, when someone decides to buy something. But that's not true. In reality, it happens in 3 stages, and the first stage begins long before any financial decision is ever made. It begins the moment you start repeatedly living around certain lifestyles and standards. Think about how many images, videos, ads, and people you see every single day. Without realizing it, you're constantly observing houses, cars, clothes, trips, restaurants, technology, daily routines. All of that becomes part of the environment around you. And the more often you're exposed to the same kind of lifestyle, the more familiar it starts to feel. That doesn't mean you suddenly want all of it right away. It also doesn't mean you rush out to buy anything. At this point, the change is much more subtle. What once stood out because it seemed extraordinary slowly stops feeling so extraordinary. It's like driving past the same scenery every day. On the first day, you notice every detail. After a few weeks, you barely notice it's there anymore. The brain works in a very similar way. It learns through repetition, and that may be one of the most powerful characteristics of human behavior. Your brain doesn't need to be convinced that something is normal. It only needs to be exposed to the same reference over and over again. The more frequently that reference appears, the more ordinary it seems. And after a while, you stop seeing it as an exception. It simply becomes part of what your brain considers familiar. Notice that up to this point, you still haven't bought anything. Not a single dollar has left your account. And yet, something very important has already changed. The reference your brain uses to decide what feels normal has changed. The standard you use to define what counts as an ordinary life has changed. And that is the first major turning point in this entire story. Because this stage alone doesn't make anyone spend more money. It only prepares the ground. What truly changes everything happens when the brain stops seeing that standard as a luxury and starts treating it as something that should simply be part of life. That's exactly where the second stage begins. After being repeatedly exposed to the same standard of living, your brain takes the next step. It quietly changes the question it's asking. Instead of asking, is this a luxury? It starts asking, why don't I have this yet? That may seem like a small shift, but it changes absolutely everything. Because the moment the question changes, the way you evaluate your own life changes with it. What's most interesting is that almost nobody notices it happening. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens so gradually that it feels completely natural. What once seemed extraordinary slowly becomes ordinary. What was ordinary starts to feel basic, and what was basic eventually begins to feel essential. Think about things that years ago people considered optional: faster internet, streaming subscriptions, multiple smart devices, ordering food through delivery apps. Today, many of those same things no longer feel like extras. For many people, they simply feel like part of everyday life. Not because anyone consciously decided to redefine them, but because their mental reference point quietly shifted over time. And that's exactly what makes this mechanism so inevitable. When this happens, people don't feel like they're raising their standard of living. They simply feel like they're keeping up with what life is supposed to look like. From their perspective, nothing extraordinary is happening. They're not chasing luxury, they're just trying to live what now feels like a completely normal life. And the moment your brain redefines what it considers a necessity, it also redefines what it considers a reasonable expense. Little by little, your entire budget begins to reorganize itself around this new definition of what's normal. Expenses that once would have felt optional now seem completely justified. Not because your income changed, but because your expectations did. And once that happens, something even more powerful takes over. After luxury starts feeling like a necessity, buying it no longer feels like a decision. It simply feels like the next logical step. And that's exactly what we're about to understand in the third stage of this mechanism. After those first two stages happen, there comes a moment when everything finally turns into behavior. And interestingly, that moment almost never feels impulsive. Quite the opposite. The decision usually feels completely rational. The person doesn't look at a particular purchase and think, I'm raising my standard of living. And that's exactly where the biggest illusion of this entire mechanism happens. Because from that person's perspective, they're not adding a new level of comfort to their life. They simply feel like they're maintaining a standard that now seems appropriate. As if that decision isn't a step up at all, just a small adjustment to keep up with everyday life. And once that logic starts repeating itself across different areas of life, it stops affecting just one purchase. It begins influencing almost all of them. A slightly better service here, a slightly more expensive monthly subscription there. And when you really think about it, none of those decisions on their own seem significant enough to completely change your budget, but they almost never happen in isolation. They accumulate, one after another, year after year, until, without anyone being able to pinpoint exactly when it happened, the cost of maintaining what feels like a normal life becomes much higher than it used to be. Do you see how this entire process works? First, what you see every day changes. Then, the way your brain interprets what feels normal changes. And only then does the way you spend your money begin to change. The purchase was never the beginning of the story. It was always the final stage. Consumption is simply the visible result of a change that started much earlier in a very subtle way. Now that you understand how this process works, you're probably asking yourself, if this mechanism affects almost everyone, why does it seem to hit the middle class much harder than any other group? The answer isn't that the middle class spends more than everyone else. It's the position the middle class occupies. Because that's exactly where this mechanism finds the perfect environment to work. A few decades ago, consumer standards changed much more slowly. A car could feel modern for years. A phone stayed current for a long time. Home appliances, furniture, and even the way people dress took much longer to feel outdated. Today, things move at a completely different pace. Products, services, and even lifestyles seem to come with a kind of social expiration date. What was considered modern yesterday can start feeling old before long. And when that happens, the line that defines what feels like a normal life keeps moving upward. That's where the difference between income groups becomes much clearer. People with lower incomes are exposed to these new standards too. They see the same ads, the same social media feeds, and the same lifestyles. But out of necessity, there's a financial limit that prevents them from keeping up with most of it. The mechanism is still there. It just runs into a barrier much sooner. At the other end of the spectrum, people with significant wealth can absorb these changes with far less impact. Even when they choose to adopt new consumption standards, those additional expenses represent only a small fraction of the assets they already own. Their financial stability remains largely untouched, but the middle class sits right between those two realities. They usually earn enough to keep up with many of these new standards. The problem is that, unlike the wealthy, they rarely have enough accumulated wealth to do so continuously without sacrificing other important parts of their financial lives. And that's exactly where the trap appears, because the real problem was never reaching a higher standard once. The problem is that the standard never stops rising. By the time the middle class finally catches up to one level, another one has already taken its place. Without realizing it, many people spend years chasing a finish line that keeps moving farther away. And when you spend years trying to keep up with a standard that never ends, the real cost starts showing up in places far more important than the spending itself. The greatest danger is that you slowly begin giving up the very things that could have transformed your financial future over the long run. And that's exactly what we're going to explore next. One of the biggest consequences of falling into this system is that as a growing portion of your income is used simply to keep up with constantly changing standards of consumption, there's less and less left to build wealth. And wealth is almost never built by the money that comes in. It's built by the money that stays invested for many years. That's the money that works while you work. It's the money that quietly grows over time. And the mechanism we've talked about today makes that process much harder, because the money rarely stays put long enough to begin that journey. It keeps circulating. It leaves your account to support a standard of living that never stops rising. And without realizing it, you trade years of financial growth for upgrades that quickly stop feeling new. But there may be an even harder consequence to notice. Even as your income increases throughout your life, the feeling of financial stability never seems to arrive. You get promoted. You start earning more. You believe that this time, you'll finally be able to breathe a little easier. But before long, that higher income already feels completely spoken for. It's as if you're always just one step away from finally reaching a comfortable place. Except that place never seems to exist. And as your cost of living continues to rise this way, another consequence appears, one that few people associate with spending. Your financial margin disappears, and along with it, so does your freedom to choose. It becomes much harder to change careers. Reduce your workload. Take advantage of an opportunity that requires an adjustment period. Handle an unexpected expense without panic, or simply say no to situations you know aren't good for you. When nearly all of your income is already committed to maintaining your current lifestyle, any change starts to feel like a risk. The mechanism you've learned about today buys small doses of immediate comfort, but slowly reduces your future freedom, and that may be its greatest cost of all. After years of living this way, many people appear financially successful on the outside. They have a good income, a life that looks stable. But on the inside, they carry the feeling that they're working harder and harder just to maintain a lifestyle that never truly brought them peace of mind. Maybe the biggest problem was never spending more. Maybe it was accepting a definition of what a normal life looks like when that definition is constantly changing. Because as long as that definition keeps changing, no income will ever seem like enough. Throughout this entire video, we've talked a lot about spending. But at its core, this was never really a story about smartphones, cars, clothes, or any specific purchase. It was about something much more important. Whoever defines what a normal life looks like for you also ends up deciding where your money goes for years to come. Because as long as that standard is shaped by the expectations of the world around you, by what you see every day, and by what everyone else seems to consider normal, your lifestyle will always rise faster than your ability to build wealth. And that's a race no one can win, because the finish line keeps moving. But here's the good news. The moment you consciously decide which standards actually make sense for your own life, something begins to change. Your money stops chasing trends. It stops trying to keep up with expectations that never end, and it finally starts working toward what truly matters. More freedom, more peace of mind, more choices. Because at the end of the day, wealth isn't about keeping up with everything the world tells you that you should own. Wealth is having enough freedom to decide what is actually worth owning. Now I want to ask you something. At what point during this video did you realize that your definition of normal may have changed without you even noticing? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoy learning about the hidden behaviors that shape your financial life and want to make smarter, more intentional spending decisions, be sure to subscribe to the channel. And if this video reminded you of someone who always says they're earning more money but still can't seem to get ahead financially, share this video with them. They might be trapped in this cycle without even realizing it.